The storm rolled across Rome with a voice older than the Senate, booming and unforgiving, shaking the city in its bones. Yet even thunder could not mask the trembling footsteps echoing through marble corridors, nor the low, terrified whispers of men who had once commanded armies, enacted laws, and held the empire in their grasp. Senator Lucius Marcus stood motionless, torch in hand, his knuckles white, eyes fixed on a door heavy enough to imprison the secrets behind it. His breath came shallow, tight. The guards at his side, silent shadows, murmured only, "Hold it steady. The emperor requires proper lighting." Behind that door, history and horror converged. There was no council, no ceremonial audience, only the manipulation of human flesh, the turning of family into numbers, and the private indulgences of a man who would become legend for all the wrong reasons. Rome, that city of triumph and law, was on the edge of an abyss it could not yet see. When the death of Tiberius spread through the imperial halls in March of 37 CE, a collective sigh of relief seemed to sweep the city. 23 years of suspicion, betrayal, and whispered threats had left the Senate and citizens alike weary, fractured, longing for a leader who could restore dignity, not administer fear. In stepped Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Little Boots, the boy who had grown among soldiers rather than silken curtains, whose name alone carried the weight of hope. Caligula's first months promised the rebirth of Rome. He smiled where others scowled, rewarded soldiers with bonuses, cut crushing taxes, and staged gladiatorial games that left the Colosseum awash in spectacle rather than despair. Senators whispered with cautious optimism, citizens cheered in the forum. And for a moment, it seemed as though a city buried under paranoia had finally exhaled. Yet beneath the gilded veneer, fissures were already forming. A serving girl vanished from the palace kitchens. The steward's excuse, flight out of fear, was whispered but never believed. Days later, her body was found downstream, marked by injuries too vile for the guards themselves to describe. Then another. A boy of 15, a girl of 17, both surfacing twisted in death, their agony visible even in lifelessness. The palace offered no explanation. The emperor smiled publicly, and the city, intoxicated by the novelty of liberation, chose dismissal over inquiry. Rome told itself that these were youthful indulgences, minor tests of power. The Senate's whispers were cautious. Surely time would temper the boy emperor. Surely the promise of Little Boots would mature into reason. But the fever changed him. In October of 37 CE, Caligula fell ill with a sudden, violent fever. Rome watched with a mixture of fear and hope. Priests sacrificed oxen, citizens prayed with trembling lips, soldiers whispered invocations to Mars and Jupiter alike, hoping for the survival of a ruler they had quickly grown to adore. Weeks passed before he rose from his bed, pale and hollow-eyed. Rome erupted in celebration. Priests declared divine intervention, citizens feasted, and the Senate proclaimed the miracle complete. But those who tended him spoke in hushed tones of a man transformed. The fever had burned away more than flesh. It had excised the fragile restraint of mortality, leaving behind the conviction of divinity. The emperor no longer walked among men as a peer or as a boy with the charm of promise. He walked as a god, untouchable and above law, morality, or family. Subtle cruelties soon followed. Invitations were sent to senatorial wives, refusals impossible, the consequences unthinkable. Young boys, heirs of noble families, found themselves chosen for palace service, only to be adorned in rouge and silk, their innocence stolen under the guise of honor. Whispers again rose, but were immediately stifled by the city's own relief, by hope turning blind, by the dangerous belief that indulgence could fade with maturity. the first cracks of systematic horror began to widen. Freedmen like Helon were appointed as masters of pleasure, tasked with fulfilling the emperor's whims, no matter how grotesque. A ledger emerged in the imperial archives, detailing not grain, not tax, but human lives. Names reduced to numbers, daughters of senators cataloged with the precision of commodity, awaiting assignment. Families who had once shaped laws and commanded legions found themselves ensnared, silent and trembling, torchbearers to their own children's destruction. And yet, in these early days, Rome was unaware of the full extent. The emperor's hunger had begun its meticulous planning, and his stage was set for the transformation of private vice into public institution. The whispers of the palace corridors were the first warning, the sounds of suffering measured, recorded, and catalogued. The system of terror, the psychological domination of the elite, the methodical subjugation of bloodlines, all were already taking root beneath the surface of a city that still believed in hope. Caligula emerged from his bed with eyes that no longer reflected the boy who had charmed Rome. They were hollow mirrors of obsession, reflecting nothing but his own self-declared divinity. The fever had not weakened him, it had sharpened him. Every smile now bore a calculated edge, every word spoken as if carved from marble, impervious and immovable. The city, intoxicated by his survival, celebrated. Priests offered sacrifices, families feasted, the Senate declared miracle. But those closest to him understood the boy emperor was gone. In his place stood a man who no longer recognized law, morality, or even the lives of those closest to him as sacred. At first, his appetite for control was subtle, a velvet glove hiding iron fingers. Invitations were sent to the wives of senators, to dine privately, to attend ceremonies, to witness divine audiences. No refusal was permitted. Those who resisted found themselves watched, their children reassigned, their political influence quietly erased. Young boys from noble households were summoned, their honor proclaimed, their service expected. But what awaited them was the erasure of childhood, the transformation of sons into ornaments of the palace, painted, perfumed, and trained to obey, in ways that stripped them of their identity. The first ledger appeared in the imperial archives, not with a flourish of ceremony, but in the sterile hand of a scribe who recorded names as if they were parcels, not people. Daughters of senators, wives of equestrians, sons of merchants, all became entries, cataloged by age, beauty, and perceived utility. Each line was a sentence, a record of control, a prelude to suffering. Fathers who had once spoken with authority now held torches, trembling, illuminating the horrors inflicted on their own families. The corridors of the palace, built of polished marble and ornate arches, became instruments of terror, each sconce and torch positioned with precision to ensure that the witness could never avert his gaze. Senators, once masters of Roman law, shuffled through these halls in silence. Some whispered verses of Virgil under their breath to stave off madness. Others counted in their minds, seeking refuge in abstraction. All felt the same helplessness. The torch was heavy, the distance measured, the punishment for faltering absolute. In these corridors, honor became a memory, courage a liability. Fathers became spectators to the destruction of their own daughters. Mothers clutched younger children, fearful that the next summons would descend upon them. The empire, in a single act of orchestration, had turned family into weapon and fear into obedience. The emperor's appetite was methodical. Freedmen like Helon were entrusted with logistics, ensuring that every ritual of humiliation was precise. every ledger entry exact. The ledgers themselves were not chaotic records of cruelty, but meticulously organized. Acquisition dates, compliance ratings, classifications. In these documents, humanity was stripped of its complexity and reduced to columns and categories. Item 247. Female senatorial class, restricted assignment. Behind that dry phrase lay shattered lives, broken trust, and fathers forced into complicity. Within the palace, architecture became a tool of oppression. Chambers were designed to carry sound, to amplify screams, to trap victims in a symphony of agony. Mirrors multiplied reflections, ensuring that no boy could escape the vision of his own forced transformation. Officers, physicians, and scribes executed their duties with military precision. Procurement, processing, monitoring, documentation. Private indulgence became institutionalized horror. And yet, the Senate and city at large remained largely unaware, dismissing the rumors as exaggeration, unwilling to imagine the full machinery that had begun to operate around them. Caligula's first intimate manipulations of family set the tone for the horrors to come. His sisters, once companions in childhood, were drawn into rituals that blurred the lines between piety and violation. Drusilla, Julia Lilla, Agrena, their presence at ceremonies transformed grief into spectacle, obedience into theater. Compliance was mandatory, resistance fatal. Rome's most sacred bonds, those of family and trust, were not merely ignored. They were weaponized, displayed as proof of the emperor's absolute power. Even in this early stage, the emperor's genius for cruelty lay in its scalability. What began as private indulgence became policy. Ledgers tracked compliance, torches enforced participation, architecture ensured observation. Senators who had opposed his rule in debate found themselves powerless when the same ledgers cataloged their wives and children. By implicating the most powerful men in their own family suffering, Caligula converted potential rivals into instruments of obedience. Fear, humiliation, and complicity intertwined until the boundaries of private life dissolved into the machinery of state-sanctioned horror. The psychological impact extended beyond the palace. Families fractured under invisible weight. Sons viewed fathers with suspicion, knowing the man who held a torch might do so again. Daughters, returned from the chambers of torment, could not meet the gaze of their protectors. Every home in Rome felt the reach of the palace's design. Every heart in the city trembled under the invisible hand of the emperor. Power had been transformed into a weapon not merely against bodies, but against the bonds that held society together. By the end of this phase, Rome remained outwardly unchanged. Markets bustled, temples smoked with incense, laws were proclaimed, feasts celebrated. Yet the city had already crossed a threshold. The foundations of trust, family, and honor were corroding beneath the surface. The whispers of palace corridors, the ledger entries, the torchbearer's silence, all signaled a deeper, systemic rot. Caligula had not merely returned from illness. He had returned to construct a society where suffering could be measured, orchestrated, and endured as spectacle. Rome awaited the full eruption, unaware that the machinery had already begun to grind. And for those who had once imagined hope in the rise of little boots, the reality of divinity claimed by cruelty had begun its inexorable expansion. The palace corridors stretched like veins through the heart of Rome, polished marble reflecting torchlight in 1,000 trembling reflections. Fathers stood at measured intervals, arms locked, torches burning high, their eyes fixed on doors behind which screams, soft at first, then rising to a crescendo, echoed off the walls. Each flicker of light fell with precision, illuminating the most intimate horrors while leaving no shadow in which a witness could hide. The torchbearer system, once experimental, had now become ritualized, a performance of obedience designed to enforce fear, compliance, and silence. In the imperial archives, the ledgers swelled with entries that reduced human life to rows and columns. Names were stripped of identity, ages and appearances cataloged, classifications assigned. Item 247, female senatorial class, restricted assignment. Item 312, male youth, high compliance potential, assigned decorative duties. Behind every dry notation lay agony. Sons humiliated, daughters violated, wives coerced. Each entry was not merely a record, but an instrument of control, a tool to enforce obedience and to terrorize the families of Rome. Senators, who had once shaped the laws of nations, now shuffled silently through the palace halls, holding their torches, compelled to illuminate their own children's torment. Some whispered scripture under their breath, others recited verses of Virgil or counted abstract numbers to distance themselves from reality. Still, the sounds of suffering, the calculated architecture that carried every cry, left no refuge. The empire's protectors had become functionaries of terror, their honor extinguished by the weight of compliance. Caligula's obsession did not end with the destruction of childhood or the humiliation of wives. His sisters, Drusilla, Julia Lilla, and Agrena, were drawn into ceremonies that merged grief with spectacle. Drusilla, elevated to the status of divine consort, became the centerpiece of public and private rituals. Julia Lilla, fiery and defiant, was forced into submission until silence became safer than resistance. Agrena, clever and cold, endured with measured restraint, storing indignities in memory as one would store coins, biding time for the day she might reclaim agency. The psychological architecture of horror extended beyond individual families. By making the most powerful men of Rome complicit in their own children's suffering, Caligula transformed rivals into captives. Compliance was not voluntary, it was survival. Fathers who once commanded armies found themselves immobilized, torch in hand, unable to protect the very flesh they had vowed to defend. Mothers clutched younger children, terrified that the next summons would fall upon them, while sons looked at their fathers with suspicion, knowing that the men who had held the torches might one day wield them again. Within the palace, architecture itself served as a weapon. Chambers were constructed with calculated acoustics, ensuring that cries carried clearly into adjoining halls. Mirrors multiplied the sight of transformation. Boys, heirs of noble families, were bathed in scented oils, clothed in silks, taught to walk and speak as ornaments rather than heirs. Their former names, Marcus, Lucius, Gaius, were erased, replaced by Flora, Lily, Rose. The ledger entries chronicled their progress, assessing beauty, grace, obedience, and even economic utility. Resistance meant public punishment. Compliance meant degradation so profound it left the soul hollowed. By 39 CE, the machinery of exploitation had reached industrial precision. Physicians trained in Alexandria's schools oversaw forced unions, evaluating fertility, prescribing diets, monitoring pregnancies, and dictating pairings for optimal offspring. The palace had effectively become a factory. Women were assigned according to genetic or aesthetic potential. Soldiers and gladiators designated for reproductive pairing. Children raised according to imperial classification. Boys trained for palace service were feminized. Girls were prepared for temple work or future ceremonies. Natural family structures were obliterated, replaced by the cold, clinical efficiency of imperial administration. Even public ceremonies reinforced this system. Banquets, ostensibly celebrations of divine favor, became instruments of control. Senators and foreign ambassadors attended as witnesses to Caligula's absolute power, observing the humiliation of wives and daughters under the guise of ritual or devotion. Every action was catalogued. Who complied? Who hesitated? Who resisted? The ledgers, duplicated and stored within the archives, ensured that no one could later oppose the emperor without fear of exposure. Compliance was embedded in bureaucracy. Silence was enforced by the threat of irrevocable shame. Caligula's innovations in cruelty were not mere indulgences. They were systemic. The torchbearers symbolized the empire's complicity. Families, once the cornerstone of Roman society, became instruments of terror. Fathers illuminated their daughters' suffering. Mothers bore witness to what could not be undone. Sons were prepped for futures stripped of agency. The city outside, the markets, the temples, the forum, remained unaware of the full extent. Rome's elite, powerless and complicit, were the first victims of this orchestrated horror. And yet, in the shadows of palace corridors, the emperor's vision expanded. Plans for a breeding program began to take shape, reducing human reproduction to a methodical process. The objective was clear: create a supply of individuals optimized for beauty, strength, and obedience, ensuring the perpetuation of his system. The foundations of family, law, and morality were systematically dismantled. Private vice had become public policy. Personal lust had been transformed into an institutional machine of control. Rome stood at the edge of its own abyss. Fathers burned with torches that lit not only their children, but the collapse of civilization's moral foundations. Senators, priests, and scribes became cogs in the machinery, their hands writing, observing, recording. Private terror had become public instrument. The empire had crossed a threshold from which it could not return, and the whispering corridors were only the beginning. In these early months of systemic horror, Caligula had revealed the terrifying power of unchecked authority. Not merely the destruction of bodies, but the obliteration of trust, family, and social cohesion. The machinery was in place, the foundations laid. And Rome, still hopeful, did not yet realize that the empire had become a theater of compliance, humiliation, and meticulous, bureaucratic terror. The dining hall shimmered with golden lamplight, polished marble floors reflecting the glow of 1,000 flames. Senators, priests, and ambassadors from foreign kingdoms reclined at long tables, their lips fixed in strained smiles as music drifted through the air. Platters of delicacies, peacock tongues, honey-drenched figs, roasted boar, were carried past, untouched, for every man in the room felt the weight of unease pressing down on him like a stone. At the head of the table lay Caligula, draped in purple and gold, his eyes alive with cruel delight. He raised his goblet, but it was not wine that silenced the room. It was his hand reaching for his sister Drusilla. He drew her close, lips brushing hers with calculated intimacy. And in that moment, every law of Rome, every sacred taboo, every centuries-old custom of dignity shattered. The room froze. Senators stared into their cups, unwilling to witness, but unable to escape. Priests shifted uneasily, their hands trembling on their sacred staffs. Ambassadors from foreign lands widened their eyes in disbelief. Silence thickened, suffocating, until Caligula himself shattered it with words spoken in deliberate calm. "My divine sisters," he declared, his voice echoing through marble arches, "blessed by Jupiter himself to share my affection as Juno shares his." The invocation was no accident. By likening himself to Jupiter, the king of gods, and his sisters to Juno, his divine wife-sister Caligula wrapped incest in the cloak of mythology. The senators were trapped between two impossible choices. To reject his words was treason, to applaud was sacrilege. And so they applauded, their hollow clapping echoing like nails on a coffin lid, sealing the empire's silence in the face of desecration. Drusilla's role in the emperor's theater had long been whispered about. When illness nearly claimed him in 37 CE, she alone had been permitted to remain at his side, tending him while priests and physicians were dismissed. Upon his recovery, he declared her not merely his sister, but his divine counterpart, his partner in both ritual and rule. She was given quarters reserved for wives, elevated above the Senate's gaze, and her husband was dispatched to a distant governorship, a political exile softened only by geography. Julia Livia, bold and fiery, had attempted resistance. Her defiance earned her punishments that silenced even her spirit. Agrippina, colder and cleverer, buried her fury, storing each humiliation like a weapon yet to be unsheathed. Both sisters endured, but neither could stop the emperor's desecration of bloodlines, for their very presence at rituals became compulsory. Drusilla became the centerpiece of this twisted theater. She presided at audiences, seated beside the emperor when senators presented petitions, her presence turning politics into spectacle. At religious ceremonies, she stood as priestess and consort, blurring the boundaries between sacred rite and grotesque parody. And at night, behind the curtains of perfumed chambers, she endured what no sister, no woman, no Roman should have been forced to endure. When Drusilla became pregnant, Caligula's mania soared to its zenith. Clad in purple and gold, he stood before the Senate and proclaimed that the child in her womb was no ordinary heir, but the offspring of a god. Born of divine blood, he declared, destined to rule both heaven and earth. Senators bowed their heads, their voices trembling as they voted decrees of honor for the unborn child. Priests offered sacrifices. Citizens were commanded to pray for the infant's health. The empire that had once prided itself on law and dignity now sanctified incest as miracle, humiliation as ritual. But fate intervened. In June of 38 CE, Drusilla died suddenly. Some whispered of childbirth complications, others of poison delivered by hands too weary to endure more. The truth, like so much in Caligula's reign, vanished into silence. What remained was the emperor's grief, a grief not soft, but consuming. Caligula did not mourn as a man. He mourned as a god, betrayed by mortality. He declared Drusilla divine, elevating her to goddess status. Temples were ordered in her name, oaths sworn by her divinity. Citizens were compelled to worship the woman he had destroyed, enshrining victimhood as state religion. Senators bowed before her statues, priests offered incense, mothers brought offerings. The desecration was complete. Drusilla, violated in life, was now venerated in death. For Julia Livia and Agrippina, her death did not end torment, it magnified it. They were forced to impersonate her, to wear her garments, to speak her words, to act her role in ceremonies. Their resistance was futile, their compliance was agony. They became echoes of a dead sister, puppets in the emperor's theater, hollowed of their own identities. Witnesses later testified that ceremonies in the palace required senators to stand in attendance as Caligula proclaimed, "If I can do this to my sisters, imagine what awaits your daughters." The message was unmistakable. No law, no tradition, no bond could shield anyone from his will. The ledgers reflected this cruelty with bureaucratic detachment. Entries recorded sisters as divine consorts, wives as offerings, children as assignments. The language stripped humanity from the sacred bonds of family. What should have been the cornerstone of Roman society, the paterfamilias, The sanctity of household was shattered, replaced with categories, titles, and classifications that disguised atrocity as administration. In the end, what made this phase of Caligula's reign so devastating was not merely the physical violation of sisters, wives, and daughters, but the obliteration of family itself. Rome's very foundation, the household, was weaponized. Fathers became witnesses to their own dishonor, mothers to their own despair, children to their own destruction. Incest was no longer a private depravity. It was public theater, institutionalized policy, and the liturgy of power. By turning family into spectacle, Caligula ensured that the empire itself was complicit in its own destruction. The torchbearers held their flames, the scribes recorded their entries, the senators applauded their shame. Rome's soul was dissolving under the glow of torchlight, and no one dared to resist. Beneath vaulted ceilings painted with goddesses and nymphs, the eastern wing of the imperial palace glittered with incense and marble. To the casual visitor, it appeared a sanctuary of devotion, altars smoking with sacrifice, hymns echoing through corridors, priestly attendants robed in white. Yet behind this mask of sanctity lay the most grotesque innovation of Caligula's reign, the temple of divine service. Here, Rome's wives and daughters were processed not as worshippers, but as offerings. Their humiliation was shrouded in the scent of perfumed oil, their degradation veiled by statues of gods whose faces had been recarved to resemble the very women enslaved within. It was a mockery of religion, a parody of piety, where exploitation masqueraded as ritual. Senators summoned to attend dared not refuse, for absence was as dangerous as defiance. Each summons arrived with an ivory token, engraved with a chamber number and time, a bureaucratic tool that disguised atrocity as appointment. Men who sought imperial favor, contracts, or political safety were required to appear at ceremonies where their wives' dignity was bartered for protection, where their daughters' purity was exchanged for survival. Silence became the price of safety. Complicity became the currency of Rome. The ledgers recorded everything: dates, names, times, outcomes, all documented with chilling precision. Notes marked enthusiasm, resistance, and revenue generated, ensuring that no senator could later stand in opposition without fear of exposure. The emperor's ultimate insurance was not brute force, but paperwork. Signed, sealed records of complicity, preserved as instruments of blackmail. The palace no longer resembled the seat of empire. It functioned as a vast factory of exploitation. Departments operated with military efficiency. Procurement ensured supply, physicians examined women like livestock, scribes documented results, and guards enforced compliance. Every act was logged, every body accounted for, every indignity preserved. The breeding program became the most grotesque expression of this system. Physicians trained in the schools of Alexandria, who had once sworn oaths to heal, were now ordered to calculate fertility as though tallying livestock. Women of senatorial rank were paired with soldiers, gladiators, or foreigners, according to what combinations promised strength, beauty, or exotic novelty. Each union was forced beneath the gaze of guards and scribes, recorded not as love or family, but as pairing event, logged for conception probabilities. Pregnancies were tracked with obsessive detail. Diets were prescribed, movements restricted, miscarriages punished. Births were not celebrated as miracles, but recorded as inventory. Infants were seized, classified, and assigned futures. Strong boys were earmarked for military training, delicate boys for palace service, attractive girls for future temple ceremonies, the less favored relegated to labor. Families were dissolved into categories. bloodlines dissected into functions. Perhaps most chilling was the transformation inflicted upon noble boys, the heirs of Rome's proudest families. Taken from their homes, they were not prepared for the battlefield, but for feminization. Within mirrored chambers, attendants bathed them in scented oils, plucked their bodies of boyhood, dressed them in silks, braided their hair with flowers, and powdered their faces until their reflections mocked the sons they had once been. Their voices were trained to rise higher, their movements rehearsed until they glided like courtesans rather than heirs. Their names, Marcus, Lucius, Gaius, were erased, replaced with Flora, Lily, Rose. The ledgers cataloged them clinically. Male attendant, age 13, grace level high, revenue potential moderate. Fathers, forced to attend presentations, ranked the children of their peers in silence, their dignity obliterated by the weight of complicity. To resist meant public punishment. To comply meant participating in degradation so profound that it hollowed Rome's soul. The records that survive from this time reveal the horror of bureaucratized evil. Notes recommending increasing inventory before festival season. Annotations praising higher revenue of younger categories. Marginalia suggesting compliance benefits from narcotics administered to resistant subjects. Human agony, written in the cold rationality of accountancy. Optimized as though it were a commodity. By 39 CE, the palace had become a machine of systematic violation. Its corridors were no longer adorned with triumph, but lined with functionaries. Guards ensuring obedience, physicians calculating productivity, scribes tallying suffering, senators holding torches. Rome's sacred cornerstone, the family, was not merely weakened, but annihilated. Husbands became witnesses to their wives' humiliation, fathers to their daughters' annihilation, mothers to their children's theft. The city beyond the palace walls still bustled with trade, prayers, and feasts. Yet the heart of the empire pulsed with corruption disguised as ritual, cruelty masked by bureaucracy, and humiliation recorded as procedure. Caligula had succeeded in what no foreign enemy had managed. He had dismantled Rome from within, not with fire or sword, but with paperwork, torches, and silence. Rome was no longer the empire of conquest. It had become the empire of compliance. The summons arrived at dawn, stamped with the seal of the imperial office. The words were sterile, bureaucratic. The senator was to report to the palace with his eldest unmarried daughter and prepare for illumination duty. No refusal was possible. To decline meant not only his death, but the annihilation of his entire family line. Wives enslaved, sons executed, children scattered into servitude. The corridor stretched 50 feet, a tomb of marble lined with iron sconces. Fathers were placed at measured intervals, torches in hand, flames raised high. The architecture itself had been designed for cruelty, doors aligned to ensure that light fell directly upon the victims inside, sight lines calculated so that no father could escape the vision of his child's destruction. Guards patrolled, whispering warnings. Hold it steady. Do not falter. Some men recited verses of Virgil under their breath. Others clung to numbers and calculations to distance their minds. But nothing could silence the screams that carried through oak doors, the muffled cries, the breaking voices, the mockery of the emperor. Each father stood paralyzed, a statue carved from shame, illuminating the very acts that shattered his family. Graffiti carved into the waiting walls bore witness to their agony. "We are the damned who breathe, the dead who walk." One senator scratched into stone, another etched, "May the gods forgive what emperors compel." These fragments, uncovered by archaeologists centuries later, testify not to resistance, but to despair. the desperate need of men to leave proof that their silence was not voluntary, that they had been forced into complicity. When the chamber doors finally opened, daughters stumbled out broken, their eyes hollow, their spirits extinguished. They could no longer meet their father's gaze, not out of blame, but out of unbearable memory. Families fractured under the weight of survival. Sons looked at their fathers with suspicion. Mothers clutched younger children in terror, and silence became the only language spoken in Roman homes. Rome's most powerful men, whose ancestors had commanded legions, written laws, and built empires, were reduced to trembling torchbearers. Their voices, once instruments of law and command, became shallow breaths in corridors of humiliation. Their honor was extinguished, their souls broken. Some drank themselves to death, others fell on their swords, but most endured, walking through Rome as if alive, while their spirits had already been entombed in the palace of torches. And yet, outside those corridors, Rome still bustled. Merchants shouted in markets, incense rose from temples, children played in streets. To the casual citizen, the empire thrived. But within the palace walls, the true empire pulsed, machine of exploitation, fueled by fear, perfected through bureaucracy, sanctified by silence. The system endured until January of 40 CE, when Caligula's reign ended in blood. Praetorian guards, once enforcers of his will, turned their blades against him. Behind the curtains of a theater, the god emperor was stabbed to death, his body hacked in rage, his cries silenced at last. Rome exhaled, but the relief was hollow. Killing the man could not erase the systems he had created. The ledgers remained. The torch sconces stayed fixed in marble. The silence of fathers and the despair of daughters lingered, woven into the very soul of the city. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered the bronze sconces, positioned with mathematical precision, confirming the testimonies of ancient writers. Fragments of ledgers surfaced, recording human lives as numbers, daughters of senators reduced to entries like Item 247. Scratched notes in stone revealed the despair of noble boys, once heirs of Rome, forced into feminization. The ruins spoke not of glory, but of shame, not of triumphs, but of torches. Caligula's true legacy was not merely madness, nor even his spectacular assassination. It was the proof of what happens when power fuses with procedure, when cruelty is disguised as ritual, when bureaucracy becomes the mask of evil. His genius, if such a word can be twisted to such ends, was not in depravity alone, but in its systematization. He turned atrocity into administration, desecration into doctrine, survival into complicity. The wounds endured long after his body fell. Daughters flinched at thunder, remembering the storm-filled nights when screams blended with lightning. Sons grew into men unable to lead, broken by the knowledge that their fathers had stood torch in hand while their sisters were destroyed. Families carried silence as inheritance, too heavy to speak aloud, too poisonous to forget. Rome never fully recovered. Though emperors rose and fell, though victories were won and monuments built, the stain of Caligula's reign lingered. For what collapsed in those corridors was not only the dignity of Rome's families, but the very foundation of humanity itself. When we speak of Caligula today, it is tempting to dismiss the stories as exaggerations, as rumors from hostile senators, as lurid tales from ancient chroniclers. But the ruins, the ledgers, the carved graffiti, and the hollow testimonies remind us. This was not myth. This was not rumor. This was history. And history does not fade. It warns.